Welcome to this latest Digital Policy Institute video webinar. As we all know, it was a wild ride for communications law and policy in 2017. We've had an active FCC under Chairman Ajit Pai, and the President and the Congress also have weighed in a lot. FCC actions on net neutrality, privacy, broadcast spectrum auctions, and media ownership, and Capitol Hill's rescission of rules under the Congressional Review Act are just the tip of the iceberg of communications policy changes. And as we look ahead toward 2018, we see, among many other things, widespread 5G wireless rollout, continued concern about privacy, and the evolution to a new television broadcast transmission standard. So let's reflect back on last year and make some predictions for the future. I'm Barry Umansky. I'm the Senior Policy Counsel and Senior Fellow at the Digital Policy Institute. Created back in 2004, our institute produces a steady stream of research and policy papers, conferences, webinars that have covered a wide range of legal, economic, and policy issues. To learn more about DPI, go to digitalpolicyinstitute.org. Today we have an absolutely outstanding panel to look back at 2017, explain the issues and arguments, and predict the likely future for communications policy in 2018. I'm in the DPI studios in Indiana. Our two Washington-based panelists and one panelist joining us from the Boston area will join us shortly. You'll find their full bios on the DPI website. In Washington, we have Deborah Berlin. Deborah is president of the Washington-based Consumer Policy Solutions, a firm that develops and advocates public policies in the interest of American consumers. She also is executive director of the project to get older adults online called Project Goal. Prior to joining and creating Consumer Policy Solutions, Deborah was senior legislative representative in the Federal Affairs Department of the AARP. And for many years, I've had the pleasure of working with Deborah on the FCC's Consumer Advisory Committee, where she is its former chairperson. Also in Washington is Howard Liberman. Howard's a partner in the Washington office of the communications law firm Wilkinson Barker Knauer. Howard began his communications law career as an attorney with the FCC's former Cable Television Bureau over 45 years ago. In fact, we started work at the FCC on the very same day, fresh out of law school. Howard later moved to the private sector, where he's represented broadcasters, cable operators, private radio licensees, and others. He also advises lenders and investors in the media and telecommunications industries. His practice focuses on the day-to-day legal and business issues of broadcasters and other media companies. And beyond just FCC stuff, including contracts, music licensing, other intellectual property issues, defamation, First Amendment issues, and of course, general corporate matters. In Massachusetts, we have Roger Entner. He's the founder and lead analyst of Recon Analytics. Over the years, he's gained a very strong reputation of a true telecom expert, and his works and commentary frequently are quoted in the media. In fact, over 2,000 times just in 2017. Among his many writings are those documenting the increasing impact of the wireless industry on the American economy. Prior to forming Recon Analytics, he was Senior Vice President and Head of Research and Insights in the Telecom Practice Group at the Nielsen Company. Also, I strongly recommend his weekly Tuesdays with Roger show via Wireless Week's website. Again, full biographies of today's panelists may be found on the Digital Policy Institute website. So let's get to work. Let's start first with a question to both Deborah and Roger. The FCC, as we know, with its action on net neutrality, has returned to the so-called light touch approach for broadband internet regulation. But it's unlikely that's the end of the story. I'd like first for Roger Entner to talk about his predictions for this, the current disposition of the FCC's decision, the court appeals brought by a variety of folks, including Mozilla, several state attorneys general, several public interest groups, possible action on Congress under the Congressional Review Act, and other possible forks in the road. Roger, let's start with you. What's going on with net neutrality? What's the future for it in 2018?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me.
Our pleasure.
It's really exciting what's happening with net neutrality. So when, if you remember, under Chairman Wheeler's leadership, net neutrality rules were implemented under Title II of the Telecom Act, and those are rules meant for the telephone network as it was designed and existed in 1934. Not really the right rules for 2016, 17, and 18 and beyond. There was a lot of resistance to it, and with the change in the White House, the chairman of the FCC also changed, and Ajit Pai became chairman. With that, they took a new look at the rules and decided to roll them back. In my opinion, this is a precursor to legislative action on Capitol Hill that will, in all likelihood, bring back net neutrality rules, just not encumbered by the heavy Title II regulations that come with the old act.
Deborah, in the meantime, what are consumers expected to do, and what is the future, in your view, for net neutrality and government regulation of internet broadband? Deborah Berlin.
Well, thank you, Barry, and thank you for convening this discussion to look at last year and how it rolls into 2018. And Roger did a very good and to the point explanation of where we are with this issue. Clearly, consumers want an open internet and deserve an open internet, and they spoke loudly and clearly about it for many years. I've been working on this issue for 12 years now, for a dozen years, since 2005, and I know that at this point there's only one clear direction that we need to take, and that's for federal legislation. We need for Congress to set the rules of the road. We've gone back and forth from one direction to the other with the FCC, and I think we need for Congress to set the path straight now, and to do as Roger has explained, to set some clear open internet rules of the road. I think that's what consumers want, and that's what they need.
Yeah, Deborah, certainly it's not the end of the line here for decision making in Washington and in the states regarding net neutrality. So stay tuned for that. I'd like to ask Howard Liberman, who focuses on media issues. Howard, there have been plenty of technical and policy decisions at the FCC in 2017, and one that kind of stands out is the move toward what we think could be a significant improvement in over-the-air television broadcasting. We're talking about something called ATSC 3.0. Howard, what exactly is that? What's its status at the FCC? And when do you think consumers, like you and me and everybody, will start enjoying the benefits of that improved transmission standard? Howard Liberman.
Thank you, Barry. Television stations in the United States currently operate they broadcast under ATSC 1, which was the standard adopted when we converted from digital to analog about 10 years ago. ATSC 3 has been adopted by the ATSC, by the committee, and just late in 2017, the FCC enacted the standard into its rules, number one, on a voluntary basis. So television stations may, but they don't have to, start broadcasting ATSC 3. Typically, it would be broadcasters in a given market would agree to start operating in that market under ATSC 3. And this will evolve over the next 2 to 3 years. I would say in the next 2 to 3 years, market by market, ATSC 3 will become the standard. What that provides for consumers, for viewers of over-the-air television, is number one, a much more robust signal and viewability in a mobile environment. So while you're walking around or driving and hopefully riding in the back of a car, not driving it, you'll be able to watch television. The current system is not very workable while you're moving. Number two, it will allow for much more enhanced features that are the typical features you think of with television of better audio, surround sound, multi-camera. So you'll be watching 5 or 6 cameras from a baseball game, and you can choose which camera to put in the front rather than letting a director in the stadium choose. Other features as well, including data delivery, so downloading of data. And all of this, as I say, will be evolving as stations voluntarily transmit or change their transmitting equipment to ATSC3.
So it won't be tomorrow, but it's going to be evolutionary. One of the other major issues that's the talk of the country, and certainly in Washington, D.C., has been privacy. And there have been several Washington-based regulatory changes. The FCC has dealt with ISPs and whether they should still be concerned about retaining consumers' private information, or instead should there be greater reliance upon the Federal Trade Commission. Roger, what exactly has been happening on privacy? What do you think it's going to be for the future? And then I want to throw this to Deborah with her perspective from the standpoint of consumers. Roger Entner.
Well, again, a couple of years back, the Wheeler FCC instituted privacy rules, but due to its regulatory reach that only applies to telecom providers, these rules were only applying to telecom providers, which completely distorted the market because the biggest users of privacy, or the areas that are most affected, are not regulated by the FCC, just at the point in time when you had telecom providers enter the market and use different levels of privacy to provide better customized services. As this distorted or was about to distort the market, Congress stepped in and through the Congressional Review Act repealed the privacy regulations that were instituted by the FCC. So right now we are back to the previous rules on privacy, which are governed by the FTC. And I think everybody is in agreement that we need stronger and better privacy rules. The big question is who will do this and who will it apply to? A lot of companies, especially on the internet side, rely on using people's private information for their business model. So understandably, they are very hesitant and reluctant to endorse any such rules, but would rather have them imposed on their burgeoning competitors. So right now, I think we are in a holding pattern, and we're back to the FTC rules that apply the same rules across all competitors and all companies that use private consumer information.
Comforted or not are you on the level of privacy for internet communications? Deborah Berlin.
Well, Barry, following up on Roger's comments here, one important shift that we have had, which I think is of great benefit to consumers, is that we have kicked this back to the FTC. And what's important there is that what consumers really need are uniform privacy protections. So we really need everybody to be in the game here. That's what consumers need. They need to know that when they go from provider to provider, from website to website, that they're going to have some strong privacy protections. Consumers don't really understand that there's a differentiation between an ISP and a a big social network or a big search engine. They want to have privacy protections wherever they go online. So that's what we really need to look for, and that's why it's great to have the FTC back in the game on privacy protections. We also don't want a patchwork of protections, so having a state here and there implementing privacy protections. What we really need is a national approach here to privacy. So that's what we're looking for, and it's good to have the FTC back in there to provide that and to work on that to help protect consumers.
There have been a lot of good points there, including the fact that consumers sometimes can't discern, what they're watching over the internet. What's the source? Is it an edge provider? Is it some other source? Well, the same thing could be said for people who watch television. And there's been a dichotomy for a long time between the rules and regulations applying to over-the-air television broadcasters that use the electromagnetic spectrum and a variety of cable-based networks and others that aren't so regulated. This last year has seen plenty of changes, a boatload of changes in the FCC's regulatory scheme for broadcasters. Howard Liberman, give us a short summary of some of those and what they mean to consumers. Howard Liberman.
Well, yes, the Pai administration lost no time in engaging in a rule change, deregulatory tilt toward broadcasting, starting with changes in the ownership rules. They repealed long-standing prohibition against cross-ownership by newspapers and local TV, newspapers and local radio. They've eliminated that rule. They've eliminated a rule that limited duopoly, how many TV stations you can own. There's still a limit, but there was something called the 8-voice test. There had to be 8 independent voices before you could own 2 affiliates of the top 4 networks. They eliminated that rule. They now have a case-by-case evaluation of proposals rather than a flat ban of certain kind of ownership. And they repealed the so-called attribution rules on joint sales agreements, meaning if you own one station and you're selling all the advertising time on a second station, that doesn't count as owning the station, which it did under a rule adopted in the Wheeler administration. That's just on the ownership side. They've also eliminated something called the main studio rule. Every broadcast station in the country until just a few weeks ago had to have a main studio in or near its community of license so people could know where to visit. And they've eliminated that rule. So a station doesn't have to have a presence in or near its community of license anymore. Probably most will, but they've eliminated that rule. But then there are others, including loosening up the EEO standards to some extent, the EEO longstanding rules that apply to recruiting and hiring for broadcast stations. They've eliminated some minor reports and some minor requirements that probably don't mean a lot, but what they have committed to do is every month to initiate the process of eliminating at least one rule. And they've been doing that in most cases, more than one rule. So every month they're eliminating a rule or two.
There's a quota system now for rule rescissions?
Call it a goal.
Okay.
So they're just eliminating rules that don't really mean much. But some of it is significant, like the main studio rule.
Like the old clearing of the regulatory underbrush decades ago. Yep.
Right.
As I was mentioning, Deborah did something I wish I could have joined her. Earlier this month, she attended the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. And that is a show, it's a major convention which showcases new gadgets, technological trends. I'd like Deborah to kind of give us a summary of what she saw and what challenges some of these gadgets and trends might pose for the FCC and maybe for consumers as well. Deborah Berlin.
Well, yes. So CES is always an interesting barometer of where technology is taking us and where we maybe hope to have us take us. So, what has grown in great numbers at CES, a couple of areas. One, of course, is the emphasis on autonomous vehicles. A big area of the show now is an emphasis on that. And also robotics, artificial intelligence, augmented reality. Those are a couple of areas of CES that have grown. And so, looking at that, also looking at the smart homes and all of the connected devices that we are starting to have in our lives and that we will continue to have in our lives. So it's looking at, our self-driving vehicle going up to our home and having that connect to various devices in our homes, looking at how that is going to have an impact on our daily life. And so all of that is what CES was all about. Never mind the TV that rolled up and we didn't get to see because it was in a private room, but apparently some in the media got to see that and wrote about that. But televisions are definitely taking off into new bright areas. And of course, the FCC needs to consider what's going to take us there, and that's going to walk us right into 5G. So
Understand. Yeah.
that's the tech that's going to take us there.
Right, I want to talk about 5G in a second, but I think one of the most amazing things I saw on the internet the last couple of, or early this month, was the pictures of Intel's robotic synchronized drones flying
Yes.
over the Bellagio fountains. That was very cool.
Right.
But Deborah mentioned 5G, the next generation of wireless communications. I mean, for a long time this has been talked about. There's a process of rolling out a new technology, much faster speeds, but it's going to need some additional siting, placement of antennas, small pizza-sized dish antennas. I'd like to have Roger first, then Deborah, and then Howard, if he's interested, to talk about the rollout of 5G. What does the FCC need do to perhaps expedite and make more confident that rollout? And then for everyone on the panel, particularly Roger and Deborah, what about the digital divide? Is this going to help bridge that divide with 5G technology next year and in the coming years? Roger first. Roger Entner.
Thank you. Well, as Deborah mentioned, autonomous cars were a big thing at CES, and autonomous cars will not work without 5G, because 5G will bring us substantially faster networks, up to 100 times faster, at a tenth of the latency, and it's both the latency and the speed that we will need for autonomous cars, because otherwise the cars cannot react fast enough to avoid accidents and bring harm to people. So what we need for 5G to become a reality is we need especially from the FCC, we need more spectrum. They have already identified or start to identify spectrum in the 28, 39, and 60 gigahertz band. We probably will need more spectrum also in the lower bands. 3.5 is a popular band that always comes up. What we also need from the FCC is, again, more help on the siting of new cell sites and the acceleration of how quickly we can bring these new sites to life. Because one of the things you have to recognize is as you go further up in frequency, the harder and harder it is to become or to penetrate for these signals walls or even skin, because if you have 5G in 28 or 39 or even 60 gigahertz, if you are moving your head and your head is between you and the antenna, the signal will drop. So you have to have a multitude of antennas all the way around you so that this will work. Similar with everything else. So this makes it really paramount that we have standardized rules that quickly allow us to deploy more sites and have access to more spectrum.
Okay. This is somewhat like the preemption we had in the earlier days of cellular towers. So there couldn't be slowdowns and lack of uniformity of local regulation. Deborah Berlin, what about 5G and the efforts to finally close that digital divide. What are your thoughts?
Well, I look at 5G from several different perspectives, Barry. First of all, from the benefit side, looking at 5G for some of the consumer communities that I'm focusing on, from the older individual's perspective, there's the benefit that we talk about from the self-driving vehicles and the telehealth and e-health monitoring perspective, that there are tremendous benefits that 5G will provide. So, I think that's part of what I'm looking forward to with 5G, is that it will enable those sorts of tech opportunities for consumers in the aging population and in accessibility areas as well. So from that standpoint, a tremendous benefit and opportunity that 5G will provide. In terms of digital divide issues, 5G small cell technology should provide greater opportunity there. So there greater connectivity there in communities should open up opportunities for connections and close some of the digital divide there in our communities.
Understandable. By the way, for full disclosure, at the CES, they had the displays, for autonomous vehicles. Well, thankfully, there also are people developing autonomous tow trucks and autonomous ambulances. So, small attempt at humor today. For decades, we've heard about we're having the convergence of media. That's a term we've talked about for a very long time. But let's face it, today, 2018, telecom, media, the internet, they're all colliding big time. How should this be approached from a regulatory perspective and a congressional perspective? Roger, why don't you start us out?
Well, I think the most important thing is to provide a level playing field. As new upstarts are colliding with established companies, everybody is trying to innovate. And the key here is that everybody is able to compete under the same rules, that there is no regulatory arbitrage that benefits one over the other, and where the government is picking winners and losers. So, because we want consumers to pick winners and losers, and have them decide what works for them, rather than somebody in a bureaucracy. The outcomes are way better when consumers make these choices, and they are evolving and changing more rapidly than any regulation can follow up, or even laws. So what's important is to have broad outlines that make it possible for everybody to go at it and provide new and innovative services for consumers. And it doesn't matter where the innovation comes from. The consumer just wants to have a better, more convenient way to access information and content.
Roger, thank you. Deborah, you've long time been an advocate for consumers, and you and I have worked on that Consumer Advisory Committee. In fact, one of the issues on their plate right now is robocalls. Deborah, what are some of the other issues, besides robocalls, other issues before the FCC that deal with the interests and welfare of the American consumer? Deborah Berlin.
Well, you just named one of the big issues for consumers, I think, that the FCC has tackled over the past year. Over the past couple of years, robocalling has been one of the number one consumer complaints at the FCC. And the FCC started this strike force to address robocalling that has been an effort along with the industry to really come up with some solutions to robocalling, to put a stop to it and to take steps to implement changes. And they have slowly been kind of pulling away at the problem, and it continues in force. So robocalling is an ongoing effort and problem, and it continues. And I don't know about anyone else on this panel, but I continue to get robocalls and continue to block them and use the tools that the industry has created to help us to manage robocalling. But other than that, the FCC has been working with consumers on slamming and cramming problems that continue to plague consumers, and other issues as well. So, while net neutrality was looming large last year, there were other consumer issues that really, are day-to-day problems that consumers face that are real complaints that consumers have filed at the FCC that the FCC has been addressing, like robocalls, slamming and cramming, and those sorts of billing issues, things like that, the FCC, the great staff at the FCC have been working to address.
Right. Certainly robocalls have been the plague for all of us. My personal view is that in addressing robocallers, we really should consider a modification of the capital punishment laws of this country, but that might not happen. I'd like to ask Howard Liberman, you are a transactional lawyer involving with the buying and selling of electronic media, telecom properties. What was the level of transactions in 2017? And under the Trump administration, what do you see the level of transactional work in 2018? Howard Liberman.
Yes, 2017 was a very strange year for transactions. First of all, for television stations, because of the incentive auction, which we can talk about separately, but that ended in March. And for a year or so prior to March 2017, there couldn't be any sales of television stations because of the auction situation and what's called the anti-collusion rules. So television broadcasters couldn't even talk to each other. So there was a lot of pent-up transaction demand that at the end of the auction, starting in April of 2017, there have been several significant transactions. One is still pending at the FCC. Others have been approved. So there's been a good bit more consolidation on the television broadcast side through these transactions, and there will be more, I think, going into 2018. On the telecommunications side, non-broadcast, some big transactions have been announced and taken place. Again, one is still pending, one of the largest ones. But the smaller and the medium-sized transactions, there are many fewer of them. And I believe that's because of either uncertainty over what the Trump administration policies will be, or even a feeling that the larger players will do well, but it will be more difficult for the smaller players under the Trump administration and its policies. So the buyers of these medium and small telecommunications company are not willing to pay as much or take as much risk. So there are many fewer transactions in that space. And so transactions will be happening, but I don't think at the pace that they have in prior years because of a reluctance to compete with the big companies who are, in some people's views, being favored by policies now.
Staying with Howard Liberman, there have been plenty of developments that grabbed the headlines during 2017. One thing that I remember kind of piquing my interest was the FCC decided to fine a group owner named Sinclair Broadcasting $13.3 million for a violation of what the FCC calls its sponsorship identification rules. What the heck was going on there? Howard Liberman.
Yes, Barry, that's a good question. This was a decision by the full commission fining this broadcast $13.3 million, and the two Democrat commissioners dissented, saying the fine should have been a lot greater. So that indicates something pretty bad was going on, or at least something the FCC thought was pretty bad. What Sinclair Broadcasting was doing was saying to an advertiser, for a certain amount of money, we will put commercials on the station that look like commercials and are identified as commercials. But in addition, what we'll give you is slots in our newscasts so that there will be a piece in the news that looks like news It seems like it's news, but it's actually being paid for. And the basic fundamental rule here in broadcasting and in other media is if somebody is paying for content to be aired, that should be identified and made clear. Number one, made clear that this is paid for, and number two, identify who is paying for it. And what Sinclair was doing was neither. They were not identifying that it was paid for or identifying who paid for it. The fine was so large is because they were doing it on many of their stations. They own many, many stations, multiple times. So that is, and some who have been around media for several years will remember an old FCC proceeding called Video News Releases, VNR.
Right.
It's the same concept. Somebody is paying to have something they produced put on the news. And that shouldn't be unless it's identified as such. So that's what they did, in a word to the wise, sponsorship ID.
Got it. We've covered a lot of stuff so far today. What I'd like our panelists to do is to offer some closing thoughts, but in those thoughts to also give our audience an idea of what they think will be, for 2018, the top developments at the Congress, the FCC, or the courts. Let's do some prognostication. Let's start first with Roger Entner. Roger.
Well, I think consumers will hear about 5G all the time. And towards the end of the year, we'll actually see the first implementations of it. And one of the things that I think consumers will realize, unlike the previous generations like 4G and 3G, 2G, 1G, 5G comes in a lot of different shapes and forms. One of the providers will focus on the Internet of Things, of devices, and that it will benefits are a lot longer battery time. Others will focus on bringing high-speed internet to the home wirelessly using 5G protocols. And another one will bring devices and phones that look very much like this, that what we use today, just a lot faster. So I think that will be one of the key things that will be coming, that 5G will be many things to many people, and it's almost inevitable that confusion will set in. My other big prediction is, yes, we will have net neutrality again, but this time through an act of Congress.
Roger, thank you. Back to Washington, D.C., and Deborah Berlin. What are some parting thoughts and parting predictions? Deborah.
Well, I think we anticipate in Congress some sort of infrastructure bill. And so I think that perhaps we may see something in the way of broadband incorporated into an infrastructure bill. So that should be of interest to those of us in the telecommunications world. And I agree with Roger that hopefully we will see something in the way of 5G in a big way this year. And then finally, I think we will see more conclusive action in the way of broadband deployment at the FCC. We have a Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee that it continues its work, and we should see some conclusive activity there, and we may see something from the FCC in that regard. So those are things I think to look for.
Deborah, thank you. Howard Lieberman, let's give us some final thoughts. And what did you see when you gazed into your crystal ball of communications policy for 2018?
Well, first of all, you mentioned Congress, and I would suggest keeping an eye on the Congressional Review Act efforts to overturn what the FCC did on net neutrality. That's taking place now and will be taking place over the next weeks and months to see if Congress can actually overturn what the FCC did. Number two, the courts. Much or most of what the FCC did on media ownership was in late 2017, meaning that the court appeals are just starting. And the courts could well overturn or modify what the FCC did by way of media ownership rules, and that'll be very important to watch. And then at the FCC itself, of course, they're going to continue to eliminate unnecessary rules and to address the various issues that are pending. But I would also watch their enforcement activities, because you can tell a lot about the philosophy and the approach of the chairman of the FCC in any given regime, administration, not just by the policies in terms of rule changes, but by their enforcement policies. So I would say keep an eye on the enforcement decisions of the FCC going forward.
So it's not just what they say, but what they do. I'd like to thank
Exactly.
our terrific panel of Deborah Berlin, Roger Entner, and Howard Liberman. And thanks to all of you for watching today as we took a communications policy look back at 2017 and offered some predictions and observations for 2018. Please visit digitalpolicyinstitute.org to see the full biographies of our panelists and to learn more about our institute and the many important digital communications topics we're following. Also, today's webinar and all of our past DPI webinars are archived on that site. For the Digital Policy Institute, I'm Barry Umansky. See you next time.